The real reason I'm here today is that Daniel sees me as a poster boy for that old adage that those who fail to take into account the mistakes of the past are bound to repeat them. So I've been around long enough to make many mistakes, and some people call me a pioneer with all these firsts that he told about, and I admit to that. I have the arrows on my back to prove that. So I am really, I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here with you today, because I live in Virginia, but I'm a displaced Californian who spent 11 years living in Santa Clara County, San Jose, and Mountain View. And a lot of my early work in the field was done there. And so my children always feel like they were Californians, even though one of them stayed in Virginia. One came back to work in Davis, so often come out here to see him. But it's a privilege to be here. And California was a first also in a lot of different ways that I'm going to speak about. But I was asked to talk to you about some of the success stories in the justice world. And I'm going to be a little bit broader than the justice world, because there are intersections between the world of criminal justice and the world of health and human services that we've had success stories in actually creating interoperability and creating ways to solve some of these complex problems that you've heard about and talked about. And I really want to say at the outset, once you get moving in this world, if you take a few steps towards the right way to do it, you'll find it's not as hard as you think it is. That doesn't mean it's not difficult and tedious, but it can be done, and it will be done, and you all will do it. I guarantee you that when you really get into that, with the momentum you've already built in California, with the leadership from many people here, Shell and others, you're going to get there, and you're going to look back and say, "Wow, it wasn't as hard as we thought." Once you do it, and you will, and I take that home with you from this meeting, because you will think that. But just talking a little bit about how this got rolling in the justice world, the very first interoperability or information sharing in the justice world happened right here in Sacramento. In 1969, there was created an organization called Project Search, which is an adhocracy, which you're laughing at that word. You know that meaning? You know who invented that term? Alvin Toffler in Future Shock. Some of you may have read that, but Alvin Toffler created that notion. And an adhocracy was a group of people who came together for a single-minded purpose, not for necessarily to promote their own sustainability. And Project Search involved over 3,000 people. I had the privilege of leading it for 5 years, and then we turned it into a nonprofit, which still exists today in Sacramento, has never left. But the purpose of that project was, for the first time, to figure out how in the world are we going to share criminal history information throughout all the states in the country, when there were, in fact, at least a dozen different complete proprietary protocols used by the different states. IBM had one, Burroughs had another, RCA in California had, their protocol. None of them could talk to each other. It was hopeless. Everybody said it's too complicated, can't do that. Well, we just got a bunch of good minds together and sat down and said, you know what, why don't we create one common protocol and make everybody convert their data into it, and then we'll share it. And we tried to get the FBI to agree to that, and they said, well, we don't think so. So we used the Michigan State Police as emulating the FBI, and sure enough, pretty soon we had 10 states sending all their data there as a pilot prototype. And immediately we started getting good, useful information that helped people in the justice system do their job. And people said, oh my God, we got to do this nationwide. And pretty soon it became the idea of J. Edgar Hoover to do it. After he saw that it worked, he sort of took credit for it, which is fine with me. I was just happy that he did it. I didn't want to be in his database anyway. I had the privilege of demonstrating the prototype to him. And right after we made it work, and we had over 100,000 records, and we put in a dedicated line from the Attorney General's office in Washington to the Michigan State Police, and we showed we could do a query and get back a response in 6 seconds, show the criminal history. And he looked at me and he said, "Young man," I was young in those days, he said, "that was very impressive, but I just have one question." He said, "What's wrong with the U.S. mail? People send us these fingerprints, we send them back, the rap sheet at 6 or 8 weeks, just all the time." And I was speechless. I said, "What do you say to an icon like Edgar Hoover?" So I drew myself up to as tall as I could and said, "Sir, that the courts won't let us do this anymore because they demand we release people in 48 hours if we can't identify them and prove that they're wanted or have a record or whatever." He said, "Who said that?" I said, "The courts have said that very loud and plain, sir." And he looked at me again. He said, "Well, that's their problem, isn't it?" So we left the room, and walked right up to Congress. And there was enough people in Congress who called him later and said, "J. Edgar, get on board." And pretty soon we did that. But that started a momentum in the justice world to attack. And the conversations that we had are the same conversations you're having here today. We spoke initially about privacy and the issues of preventing the abuse and misuse of this kind of data for purposes other than what it was collected for. Which, isn't that really what you've addressed in your privacy issues? It's not that you shouldn't have the data, it's that it shouldn't be abused, and it shouldn't be used for non-legitimate purposes. We wrote laws, even way back then, to make that more difficult to happen, and it really has worked pretty well. But we also had issues of security. We had issues of architecture. Every one of the committees that you heard about from Gretchen about in the governance process were topics back then. And we slowly, over the years, resolved many of them. What Justice did, which is a very insightful thing, was after that went on for a while and people got back about 12, 14 years ago, Justice Department heard from a lot of people at the state and local level that, we buy all these damn computers and they can't talk to each other. Why is that? And people kept saying, those damn vendors give us these systems and they can't talk to each other. And some of the smarter people at Justice said, "Well, did you ask them to?" Well, no, we didn't really. We just got them. So they said, well, maybe we ought to come up with a way to make these computers talk to each other and make it easier to exchange information. And they went to the Attorney General at the time and said, "We need to do something about this." And she said, very wisely, "Well, you probably want to talk about standards. And if you do that, you better get industry involved, because you can spend all your time coming up with standards, and if the industry doesn't buy into them and support them, you're going to be dead in the water." So that's one of the things they did, was asked me to create a nonprofit institute called the IGES Institute to engage industry, companies like Oracle and now 160 companies, to help find answers to the technological side of this issue of information sharing. But they also said the practitioners have to drive this. Practitioners have to decide what we do. It's not the technologists, whether they're in government or out of government. It's the people who have the need, the business need to share information, that must determine how it is we do that. So one of the things they did was create a group called the Global Information Sharing Advisory Committee to the Attorney General. In federal language, it's called a FACA, Federal Advisory Committee Act, officially designated. They have rules of how they operate. They can't take on operational things. They can only give advice, but they do so in a way that makes their advice very solid. And what they did was invite all the major associations of practitioners engaged in criminal justice to be a member. So the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the National District Attorneys Association, the National Association of Attorneys General, and so on. 32 different national associations that truly represent every discipline engaged in the justice process. National Center for State Courts. They each have a one vote, but their association appoints somebody to this advisory board, and so they become a very strong influence, because the theory is if they come up with something that ought to be done and advise the Attorney General accordingly, that they'll take it back to their associations and get buy-in. And in the end, what the Attorney General realized, that buy-in is critical. You've heard that today already. You'll hear more of that. You know, the closer you can bring people from the practitioner community into the decision-making process, the more likely you are to have them buy in. I had at the Stewards of Change Symposium that's done every year with Johns Hopkins University 2 years ago, the provost, that was also the CIO from Johns Hopkins, stood up, very, very smart woman who very perceptively said that Johns Hopkins University used to have this idea that the field of dreams approach. We'll build it and they will come. And, you know, as a government entity, the federal government has often had that same field of dreams notion. We'll build it and they will come. What happens if they don't? And in the Johns Hopkins case, they found in many cases they did that and they didn't come. So finally some smart professor said to the group, well, what happens if we invite them in on the creation of this product? And she said, and when we do that, they're already here. So you just simplify that whole process. So one of the things that this group of, this called Global, did in justice was they said, okay, let's get the people who have the need and have the problem together to come up with the kinds of standards we need to share information. And the federal government was smart enough in this instance to take a hands-off approach, to not say to the practitioners, this is what you must do, but to give the practitioners, and they provided funding to pay for travel and meeting times and staff support, but they said, you people at the state and local level think you're smarter than we are? Well, we think you might be. So we want you to come up with the standards, not the federal government, nobody in justice, nobody in the Department of Homeland Security or anywhere else, not even the FBI. You're going to do it yourselves. So they had people come from all the jurisdictions, from state, county, city, towns, regions, to come together, representing all the disciplines. This very similar problem, and maybe even in some ways worse problem in the justice world than you have in the human services world, because you have all these disciplines who are designed constitutionally to be adversarial. And of course, as you know, we're sitting in the room that's owned by a certain segment of the criminal justice system who assures us all that they're superior to any other segment. You know, the courts, all judges are convinced they are indeed God. So this group of interdisciplinary people developed a standard for what does data mean? What are the definitions? You know, how do you resolve the meaning of the word case, for example? I bet you of the 125 people in this room, we could probably find 100 different definitions of that term if we tried hard enough. But they got together some now 7,000 terms that have been agreed upon, their definitions agreed upon, not just in the justice world, but across 15 different communities of interest. And that was a very powerful step. And then they looked at, with working with industry, they said, what are the impediments to information sharing? You've heard already today, and you'll hear more about this, and you heard this at your last conference. A lot of the impediments have nothing to do with technology. They have to do with culture. They have to do with the lack of a clear vision for what you're attempting to do. They have to do with the fact that you can't measure success. You haven't defined the metrics by which you'll know when you succeed. And these things have really nothing to do with the technology. What's important in the technology area is to come to agreement on the standards that will be used to simplify and reduce the cost of implementing the policies that you make to serve each other's best interests. So that's what happened. So what came out of this is this thing you've already heard about called NIEM, and I'm not going to dwell on this, mainly because I don't have time, but NIEM really had this notion of a large complex process with a standardized exchange across domains, across communities of interest, not attempting to destroy any legacy systems, but rather to create standards for data that is in motion between systems, so that systems become loosely coupled, which is probably the most important principle in this whole field. And NIEM was an answer to this problem of increased cost for creating interfaces. And that's how it all developed as a structured approach. It's more than just a data model. It's a methodology with tools freely available, and by that I mean really free. They're on the web at NIEM.gov. You can download them yourself. It's not a system. There was a time in the Office of the National Coordinator in HHS where some doctor said, well, this is just a CIA plot to get all our patient data. And, everybody really thought that was pretty funny because there is no system here. NIEM is a set of guidelines for exchanging data. There's no repository. It's not, a meds or anything else. But it doesn't always get through to people. But the process consists of a community of interested people, a technical framework, and a support framework that really is to connect legacy databases using commonly formatted data. And you've already seen that a lot of domains have joined this party. And there's a process for building exchanges. Governance at NIEM is not too different than what you heard about earlier. There's an executive steering council, there's a small staff of a program management office, and then there are operational committees that drive what happens. And the committees are where the action is. The Communications and Outreach Committee, Technical Architecture Committee, and the Business Architecture Committee. A little more simplified than what you heard about earlier, but I was the first chair of the Communications and Outreach Committee, and that was an interesting symbol too, because I was the only non-federal government employee that was allowed to be a chair. And eventually the bureaucrats forced me out. But for a couple of years, I had that position, and we operated as a consortium of users and caring technologists to make this happen. Now each of the domains in NIEM has their own sponsor who has the ability to change the data content in those domains independently of the whole model. And you all are very familiar with ACF, and they have a joint responsibility for the human services domain along with New York's Connect program, which you'll be hearing about tomorrow. So there is a wide variety now of domains. And I'm not going to dwell on the value proposition. You've already seen some of that, but these slides will be available if you want them. But I do want to talk about this one example of the impact of NIEM, because it illustrates the fact that in today's world, you can't just take a single domain in almost any social issue of significance and assume that you have the power to solve the problem, because there are too many different players involved. This is a good example. And this is another place where California led the nation. California was, I believe, the very first state to pass a law requiring pharmacies to report to the state the sale of controlled substances. And the state was then able to build a database so that if you were, an addict or a crook who wanted to collect a lot of OxyContin and sell it in the schoolyards, and you were doctor shopping, the state had the ability to search those files and find that out, investigate those crimes. And because this is an enormous problem, the prescription drug abuse is the biggest drug problem in this country, other than marijuana. It's abused more than heroin and crack cocaine and any other drug. In fact, 1 in 5 teens in middle school have abused prescription drugs. It's an enormous problem. So the problem in California, even though they had a system at the state level, is, well, if I got tired of doctor shopping in California and wanted to go, get some more drugs, I just went to Nevada and signed up another 40 doctors and got more OxyContin, but there's no way for California and Nevada to exchange data. So in comes NIEM. We built a capability to see across state lines using a NIEM information exchange standard. Prior to that, there are now, most states now have this prescription drug program. And so we actually have this ability now for states to look into each other's databases. The first pilot project was California to Nevada. So doctors and investigators in California, both people involved in substance abuse treatment and law enforcement, where there was a reason to do so, can get access to the other states' data and see whether or not somebody's doctor shopping. And it's significantly reduced that problem of interstate exchange. So NIEM has really gotten very widespread now that HHS has adopted it, both for a health and human services domain, and I was able to convince Canada to adopt NIEM recently, so they're now implementing a joint project with HHS to track pandemic flu data across international borders and also stolen vehicles. And we've created a new cyber and biometrics domain, and I'm not going to dwell on this. One of the biggest things that's happened, some people have said, NIEM takes too much thinking. I don't have time for that. I'm just going to build this exchange and get it over with. And it's not really not true, but just to fight that, the NIEM community has now created what's called a universal modeling language profile of NIEM, which makes it, you can automatically create the code to do the exchange from that profile, with business people doing the definition, not having to have a lot of technical involvements. And NIEM 3.0 is coming out in a month or two, which has the new domains and extensions to the existing domains and much more useful stuff in family services and human services more broadly. So there's a lot of good stuff happening to make that move forward. Now, one of the things that you're faced with is that NIEM only covers this data modeling part of information sharing. There's a lot more to it, as you've already heard, and you heard since your last symposium and even today. The global group in Justice realized that, and they went forward with a host of other standards-related products, and including one of the most important ones is the Federated Identity and Privilege Management, which is a national standard to create trust between computer systems. And if you're going to want to do this even inside of California, but certainly throughout the nation, to have the ability to create trust between systems, because there is no single system in human services anywhere that's going to have all the users of all the systems in the whole country signed on and validated. No one can afford to do that, and no one will do it. Federated identity management is crucial to the success of this, as is privilege management. How do you control privacy issues if you don't have a way to determine that a particular user has a particular set of access rights, privileges to get to that data? So there is a standard out there called the Global Federated Identity and Privilege Management Standard, which you can use freely. It's on the website, NIEM.gov. There's also a reference architecture that was designed to take a standard service-oriented architecture and apply it to justice. You may want to do something similar for a state-based enterprise architecture following the service-oriented architecture that Gretchen talked about earlier. There's a whole set of products like that which you can freely use. But the most important thing you can do is to begin to identify what standards do you really need to have in place in order to do this big time. You know, starting with some pilot projects is a great idea. It's the way we all do business. But if you're going to really build information sharing for all the human service agencies and health organizations in California, you can't, first of all, stop at the California borders, because you do business, whether you like it or not, with other states. You do business with the federal government. It's, you know, what we've established with NIEM and some of these other programs is that the state and local worlds can drive the national solution to this, not just a federal solution. It's not sufficient to allow the federal government to determine what happens at the delivery level. And you have that capability to do that. And California can once again lead the nation in building out this capability, but it's very important that you do so in collaboration with the other states and jurisdictions that are of a like mind, and there are many of them out there. Some of them came to your last symposium, and they're moving forward. This is not an insurmountable job. You have the ability to handle it. You have the ability to make it happen in California as well as in the nation. Thank you.